so there could be some kind of preemptive strike, maybe a massive strike using conventional weapons, not nuclear weapons, but somehow to prevent a nuclear strike being launched anywhere on Ukraine by the Russians.
Yeah.
Prevention is essential, they say, because after a nuclear weapon is launched, the horrific consequences will be difficult, impossible to prevent.
To the latest on Ukraine, a retired four-star army general has today doubled down on the United States' commitment to taking significant action against Russia should it use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Speaking to ABC News today, David Petraeus, who's also a former CIA director, says American forces and their allies would destroy Russia's troops and equipment in Ukraine, as well as sink its Black Sea fleet. Earlier today, President Zelensky said the Ukrainian army has cleared all Russian troops from a strategically important city in the east of the country. Moscow had been using Liman as a rail hub to help support its soldiers in the region. The city is situated in the Donetsk province, which was annexed by President Putin on Friday. I've been speaking to Askold Krushelnycky, a Times journalist based in Ukraine. He told me why the country's success in Liman was a key moment for the forces.
It's very significant. Militarily, it's an important achievement because Liman is a transport hub for rail and roads. It continues the Ukrainian military's push of the Russian occupying forces south. The push began last month when Ukrainian forces launched a surprise attack on the northern region of Kharkiv, and they routed Russian troops there, and they've continued pressing them back, and they've got to Liman, which has been a particularly humiliating defeat for Putin because it came the day after he had announced that area was being incorporated into Russia forever.
You're based in the country, of course, Askold. Tell us how the Ukrainian people are responding to this latest moment of the war.
Well, of course, over the last couple of weeks, Russia's President Putin has alluded to Russia's huge nuclear arsenal, and he's implied that if the Ukrainians didn't surrender, or if they were threatening to push to inflict a defeat on Russian forces on the ground in Ukraine, then Moscow would use nuclear weapons, and that kind of rhetoric has increased. And yesterday, one of his chief allies, a guy called Ramazan Kadyrov, who's the commander-in-chief of the Chechen Republic or Chechen area of the Russian Federation, actually called on Moscow to use a low-yield, he said, nuclear weapon, which means a tactical nuclear weapon. Ukrainians have they're not blasé about this. Everybody, of course, knows what the catastrophic effect of a nuclear weapon would be. But I've spoken to people who said that we can't be cowed into submission by this. People try to believe that Putin wouldn't actually use a nuclear weapon because he's been told by the Americans and the West generally that there'd be a catastrophic response if he did that. That would be dreadful for the Russians.
Yeah.
But that threat is hanging over people's heads.
I've mentioned the former CIA director, retired four-star Army General David Petraeus. He's been speaking on the American Sunday shows today, and to ABC News. He has said that the US and their allies would would go full throttle. They would destroy Russia's troops and equipment in Ukraine. They'd sink its Black Sea fleet if Vladimir Putin uses nuclear weapons in the country. So they wouldn't be afraid to go into Ukraine and destroy what parts, whether their troops, equipment were there at that time. He has, conceded that, of course, wouldn't be part of NATO. Ukraine isn't in NATO, so it wouldn't trigger the alliance's article, which calls for collective defence. But he's very much there set out the US's stall, saying that there's no doubt that they would go in.
Yes, the American President, Joe Biden, has said that there would be a catastrophic response. And I've heard from people who are in the American military before, suggesting that one of the responses would be to sink the Black Sea fleet. So it's interesting that General Petraeus has repeated that as one of the retaliatory actions. And the Americans have made it clear that they would inflict a harsh response. Ukrainians will be pleased to hear this, but I've also spoken to lots of Ukrainian officials and military and just ordinary people who hope that American surveillance will allow them to notice nuclear warheads being taken out of storage by the Russians and prepared for use. So there could be some kind of preemptive strike, maybe a massive strike using conventional weapons, not nuclear weapons, but somehow to prevent a nuclear strike being launched anywhere on Ukraine by the Russians.
Yeah.
Prevention is essential, they say, because after a nuclear weapon is launched, the horrific consequences will be difficult, well, impossible to prevent.